Hello and welcome. My name is Stacy Bersani, Program Manager for IEEE-HKN. IEEE is the world's largest technical professional organization dedicated to advancing technology for the benefit of humanity. We thank you all for joining us for today's GradLab session. Before we begin, please note a few housekeeping items. Note that we recommend using a wired internet connection to access today's presentation and closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background that could cause issues. There is no dial-in number for this event. Please make sure your computer speakers or headset are turned on and the volume is up so that you can hear our presenters. If you have any questions for today's presenters, you can submit them through the Q&A tab on your screen. We will answer as many questions as time allows. Our event today is IEEE-HKN GradLab, Unpacking the Baggage from Academia. During this session, Amy Jones and Vikrant Shah will discuss expected and unexpected challenges they faced while transitioning from their respective part-time and full-time degree programs to the cluster-oriented engineering industry. If you would like to post on Facebook about this event, please use the hashtag #IamHKN. At this time, I'd like to hand it over to IEEE-HKN student governor and our moderator for today, Joe Green, who will introduce our guest.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much, Stacy. First and foremost, I just have to say how excited I am to join both of you here today. I think this is going to be a really fun conversation, and I'm excited to dive into both of your experiences to talk a little bit more about this issue that, well, all of us as graduate students will have someday, but is seldom really talked about in mainstream channels. Really, over the course of today's episode, we really hope to demystify the unique challenge faced by both of you, our speakers, while navigating their degree program and discuss how transitioning from academia affected your start in industry. Some questions we'll cover are what struggles persisted through their degree path, how did careers change, what traits had to be unlearned, and what considerations went into this transition from industry, as well as what should be more exciting, a live Q&A session with our awesome guests afterwards to answer all of your questions. First and foremost, to introduce the incredible people who will be speaking here with you today. First off, we have Amy Jones. Amy Jones is the display product manager in John Deere's construction division. Most recently, she led the Operations Station System and Modular team, where she was responsible for supporting factory production of cabs, as well as leading new development of common components and systems for the construction division. In 12 years with John Deere, she's held roles in software test and system design. One of her proudest accomplishments was leading the team that delivered 11 new models of excavators to produce for global markets. Amy is a senior member of IEEE and a proud alumni of the Gamma Theta chapter of Eta Kappa Nu. In her spare time, she loves spending time with her family, watching Jeopardy, and supporting STEM outreach to build the next generation of engineers. Our next incredible speaker is Vikrant Shah. Vikrant is a roboticist working on the long-tail challenges to make autonomous vehicles mainstream. He has engineering degrees from UT Austin, MIT, and Northeastern University. He started his career as a subsea engineer in the deep water oil and gas industry, working on autonomous technologies and ROV-based remote interventions. With the robotics industry accelerating, he decided to further his true passion and go back to work for a PhD as a way to get current with cutting-edge robotics. His PhD work involved traveling to Antarctica to perform autonomous surveys of penguin colony health, awesome by the way, develop undersea autonomous vehicles, design an autonomous trash picking up robot, and his PhD thesis focused on mapping drifting icebergs using multi-beam sonar and cameras. His interests are racquetball, cricket, hiking, skiing, and trance music. With that, please help me in welcoming our incredible guests, and I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Amy Jones.
Thank you so much for that incredible introduction, Joe. I probably should have made Vic go first because I know I can't compare to penguins, but I'm really happy to be talking to you all today. The first thing I wanted to share was a little bit about my journey with respect to academia. So in my background, I attended Missouri University of Science and Technology for undergrad. I started there in the early 2000s and graduated in 2008 with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. I liked school a lot, and so I got a lot of minors, business, math, and psychology of leadership. One of the things that I'll be talking about today was really a key decision for me. Wanting to get a graduate degree and continuing to learn was something that I felt was very integral to me as a person. And so the only question that I was trying to answer at that time was, do I go straight to grad school, or do I work and then either go back to grad school or do it while I was working? I ended up making a decision to go to work full-time, starting out at a small electrical contracting firm, doing some work on large-scale industrial and commercial construction projects. It was a fantastic learning experience for me, but 2009 was not maybe the best time to be in the construction market. So when I got laid off, I had an opportunity to join John Deere full-time, which is a place that I'd done some internships while I was in college. Immediately after joining John Deere, I decided to take advantage of some of their benefits around tuition reimbursement. So I started my master's degree in electrical and computer engineering from Purdue University that fall. That degree took me about 4 years to complete. It was fully remote, and I did not complete a thesis to do it. That was a really interesting time. I learned a huge amount while doing it, both academically and about myself, that I'm looking forward to sharing. In 2014, I took a pretty big step career-wise and moved from software test into an area called systems engineering for an excavator product line. That was a position that was really focused on high-level definition of customer requirements, features, and integration of an electrical system into a larger vehicle. I did that for several years and really found that systems engineering was a passion for me. And so I completed a certificate in systems design and management at MIT. That program was primarily remote with some on-campus aspects to it. That has been really advantageous and applicable to me in my career. In 2020, I moved into a role where I was supervising a large systems team. And then most recently, I very, very recently, as of like 3 weeks ago, took a new job doing some work with display product management. So overall, my decision to get a degree was never in question. I was always going to do some kind of a graduate degree. The first decision was, do you do it while you're working or not? And then the second question was, what kind of a degree do you get? Do you get an MBA? Do you get a master's degree? Is it in electrical? Is it in some other areas? So I wanted to walk you through a little bit of my thought process as I decided to get both of these degree programs. So the first one let's talk about, I think, is a big decision that a lot of people face, especially when they're relatively towards the end of their undergraduate program. A lot of us are in IEEE and Eta Kappa Nu because we really are passionate about continuing learning and because we're successful in an academic environment. So I sat down and I was trying to figure out, what do I do? Do I go do a master's degree? Do I do a PhD? And if I do that, do I do it immediately? Thinking about continuing immediately to grad school, I thought that there were some real benefits there. The first thing that I noted down is the continuity of study. So it is amazing once you graduate how quickly you start to forget calculus. Personally, I think it's a little bit of PTSD, but continuing immediately does mean that a lot of the higher level work that you do is still fresh in your mind, which can make you a little bit more successful in a graduate program. The second positive to continuing immediately, there is still a very strong community of peers and strong connections with the faculty, especially at my undergraduate institution. I really felt that as I was a senior in that electrical engineering program, that I could have asked multiple different professors to work with me on a graduate degree or to be a reference for me at another school should I have wanted to do that. Going back after you've been gone for a few years, one of the sad truths of graduating is that you very quickly get replaced by more brilliant electrical engineering students. And so I was afraid that if I'd waited much longer to go back to graduate school, I wouldn't have that same connection with the faculty. The third positive is a little bit more specific to me. I really loved the academic environment. I loved that it was clear expectations. It was very regimented with respect to schedule, and there's a lot of security in that. You're in kind of this little environment where the most important thing is what you're learning and contributing. And you don't have to necessarily deal with as many of what I considered like the scary adult things, like figuring out insurance and trying to figure out what a 401k is and how you contribute to it. So for me personally, that was very attractive, the idea of being able to kind of stay in an academic bubble for a little bit longer. And then the final benefit that I identified was a shorter program. Lots of people that I was familiar with had said, you know, if you go to graduate school right after you graduate, you can leverage a lot of your undergraduate work towards your graduate degree. And by focusing on it completely, you're going to have a shorter program. So you could finish a master's in a year and a half. You could immediately move on to a PhD if that's something that's interesting to you. So altogether, that was an incredibly attractive choice. What I was afraid of was the list of cons. So the first drawback I saw to continuing immediately, I was a little nervous about specializing so much that I would limit my future opportunities in industry. I had done the things that you're supposed to do. I had talked to a lot of companies, I'd done multiple internships, I'd done senior design projects, but I still wasn't sure really what I wanted to do as far as my long-term work. I didn't have a huge passion around any specific topic or any specific industry that I wanted to be in. And so I was a little afraid that I was going to specialize so much that I would end up cutting out something that I would really enjoy doing in the future. The second thing that was a big consideration for me, money is fantastic. And getting a regular paycheck, especially after years and years of ramen and the typical undergraduate lack of funds, I really thought that would be a nice change to have some disposable income, especially when a lot of the companies that I was looking at had benefits around paying for graduate school. It seemed like that would take a lot of the pressure off of the process if I was able to get somebody else to finance the majority of it. The third thing was I still had some things that I needed to work out with respect to what I wanted to do. As I mentioned, the specific topic of what I wanted to study was very much up in the air. You know, I considered sensors, I considered power engineering, but I was also unsure of what do I want to do as far as an ultimate path. You know, do I want to take a PhD? Do I want to complete the master's degree and stop there? That seemed like something that I could have figured out while I was working on the program, but it also seemed like maybe a risk of wasting a little bit of extra time and money trying to figure that out in the middle of a very demanding program. And then finally, a factor that I don't think we take into consideration enough. I was really tired after 5 years of undergrad, really working hard consistently, being involved in as many leadership positions on campus as I could. Honestly, I kind of felt like I wanted a bit of a break. And I wanted a chance to maybe have evenings without homework. And so that ended up being a deciding factor for me, just the need to recharge a little bit and focus. I think it would have been logistically easier to continue on to graduate school immediately, but I don't think I had the mental health and the focus to really do it right away. So as you heard in my introduction, I ended up going to work, and then pretty soon after graduating, about 2 years, I started a master's program. Now, when I decided I was going to start a master's program while working full-time, there were still, of course, yet more decisions that had to be made. The first one was a big one. What are you going to study? Are you going to continue with a technical education, or are you going to move into an MBA or an engineering management degree? What do you choose? For me, the consideration that made the biggest difference is that in talking to people who had gotten business or management degrees, they said that the largest benefit that they got out of that program was by leveraging their past experience into their coursework. And so I really felt that I didn't have enough experience in industry in order to really take full advantage of those degree programs. On the other hand, my technical work was still very much where my focus was early in my career. And as I mentioned previously, I was afraid of forgetting too much calculus and differential equations and really useful things before I decided to pursue a technical degree. So that was a strong reason why I decided I wanted to do a technical degree. Another factor, and I will be completely candid, I felt like a technical degree carried a little bit more prestige, especially early in my career. You hear a lot, especially in a large company, about people who pursue MBAs, but people who can do a technical master's degree tend to be a little bit more prestigious. So I was very motivated by that as well. The second question is, where are you going to study it? There are so many fantastic universities and graduate programs. For me, one of the big things that I wanted is I wanted to make sure that there was a really solid engineering program, especially with coursework. And one of the criteria for me, I'm located in Iowa. We have some fantastic schools that are relatively close to commuting area, but I didn't really want to spend a lot of time driving in all of these fantastic Midwest winters. So for me, having a remote program was a really big deciding factor. Now, the level of remote that some of these programs has varies pretty significantly. In some pieces of Purdue's program, there were courses that you could take that required on-campus lab components. So you would have to travel to campus for a couple of weeks in order to complete those. I chose a program that was completely remote. I did not set a single foot on Purdue's campus at all during the total course of my program. There were some challenges with respect to that. If I was doing it again now, I think I might have chosen a little bit more of an in-person aspect to it. But at the time, I really wanted to make sure that my focus was going to be on my new family. It was going to be on really excelling at work. And so I didn't want to have that requirement. The benefits of some in-person components to a program. One is that it really helps you to build a community, which is one of the things that is especially key when you're doing grad school while working. The second benefit is that connection with faculty is very important. I think a lot of times in undergrad, there are logistical pieces of the degree that you solve by going to the registrar's office for a couple of minutes in the afternoon. I did not have that option. It was always a phone call trying to figure out who to talk to. I did not have a helpful department secretary to help me out. Having an in-person component would have really facilitated some of the logistical pieces as well to the degree. And then finally, I had to choose if I was going to complete a thesis or coursework only. This is an area where I chose to do it through coursework. So my program was really 10 classes and then the degree was awarded. I do think that this means that I had a less rigorous master's degree because there wasn't that independent research component. But it also meant that I did not have to clear any of my employer's work and intellectual property to apply it to a degree. This is something that's probably a pretty significant restriction if you decide to do a degree program while working full-time. Your employer's IP protections are going to come into play when determining what you can and cannot share with your institution. So the really valuable stuff, what is the lessons that I learned? With my first degree at Purdue, I was expecting it to be really applicable to my work right away. That really was not the case. There were pieces of it that were applicable, but I learned very quickly that there's no such thing as a class about how to design an excavator. And so the work that I was doing was so focused into the specifics of what I was doing that the coursework was really interesting theoretically, and there were a couple of places where I used it. But I learned that if I was going in hoping that my degree was going to make me a better software test engineer or a better systems engineer, that didn't happen. The benefit of my systems engineering certificate was immediately recognizable. But the difference between those two programs, my master's degree in electrical engineering was focused on a very academic understanding of control theory. My systems certificate was really aimed at working professionals, and so it was much more project-based. So something to consider if you think about how applicable you would like it to be to your work. The second benefit, I think there is a huge amount of built-in perspective when you are going to work and working academically. I look back on my time in undergraduate, and there were times when I really killed myself getting from like a 95 to a 97%. When you're working and you actually have your livelihood at stake, you have family, you have a house that you're buying, you have a child maybe that you're having, that makes a pretty significant difference, and it really puts the importance of what you're working on in perspective. That's also the case with respect to the actual content that you're studying. It is a really interesting thing to go from the specifics of doing maybe an integral where you have to remember to add that constant at the end, and then being in the real world where you realize pretty quickly that if you forget your constant, your math is off, and it's pretty obvious. Not the best example, but I think you get it. The third thing I had to learn is that school could not be my first priority while I was working. I was a solid A student in undergrad, and I was a solid B student in graduate school. That was a really hard adjustment for me to make. I think a lot of us are successful academically, and we very quickly tie a little bit of that excellence to who we are as a person. And so making the adjustment and coming to terms with doing my best, even though my best was different than my best was in undergrad, was a pretty significant challenge. And then the fourth thing I learned is that the logistics are more complicated. It is going to take longer to complete a graduate degree while you're working than it is if you're going to focus on it. I finished my graduate degree and it just barely was shorter than my entire undergraduate degree, and that was for 10 classes. The real kick in the pants is that I finished 5 of those classes my first year, and it took me the other 3 years to finish the second 5. That is something that you need to know yourself. You know, are you capable of slogging through this for years and years and years, having that additional commitment, or is it something where you want to focus on it and bang it out? Completely up to you. Depends on what you want out of life, but that is something to consider. And then there's a few things that I did that I think really made a difference in my being successful in graduate school. The first thing, as I mentioned, is being realistic with your expectations. I very quickly identified the Pareto principle as being something that was very true for me. You know, I got 80% of the benefit from, maybe that last 20% didn't matter so much. So again, that goes back into school not being your first priority. You have to understand that you're being paid for a job and you have to do that first. The second thing that was particularly helpful was leveraging the employee benefits that your employer offers you around graduate school and making it a criteria for selecting a job. My first position in the contracting company, there was no tuition reimbursement. There was no benefit around continuing education. And financially, when you're starting to take care of things like student loans and getting established as an adult, you're really not going to have necessarily a lot of money to put towards a graduate degree. When I moved to John Deere, it was night and day. There was tuition reimbursement. I was welcome to use John Deere's facilities for things like proctoring exams. If I had chosen to do a thesis or a research project, John Deere would have supported that. When I went back and did my systems engineering degree, John Deere asked for me to do that degree. And so there they paid for everything. Flights to Boston, they paid for my housing, they paid for a laptop so that I could do all of my coursework. So having a company that is supportive is a really significant benefit if you decide to do graduate school while you're working. The third thing is creating a community. So I mentioned that I finished about 5 classes in my first year of my master's degree. After I finished the first 2, I immediately went out to all of my friends and I became Purdue University's most avid recruiter. I got about 3 of my friends to decide that they would like to get a graduate degree from Purdue as well. And we immediately decided that we were all going to take the same classes as much as we could through the rest of the degree program. So after that first 3 or 4 classes, I had friends that I could take with. I had a study group in person. It's really challenging, especially in graduate classes where people are very focused on their own research, to try and make a connection with people when you're off campus, when you have never met these people in person. No shade to the people actually doing their graduate work. They don't necessarily have the time to work around somebody's full-time job in order to help you understand your controls homework. So having that local community was really important for my success and also for how much I enjoyed that program. Similarly, when I did the systems program, there was a huge cohort of people from John Deere who were taking that program at the same time. And that was also a big benefit, having somebody to bounce ideas off of. It's one of the reasons that IEEE is so important to us and HKN as well. That community makes a difference. And then finally, be open-minded about what education is going to be useful to your goals. If you talked to me right after undergrad, I would have told you that absolutely the technical master's was going to be the most important thing that I was going to do. And I would never do something like a certificate. Why would you do a certificate if you don't even get a degree with it? Amusingly, that certificate has been so applicable to the work that I do. And my graduate degree is really just there for me. Similarly, I was really down on MBAs and management programs and things like that. Now in the position that I am, where I'm doing a lot of leadership, a lot of product management, those may end up being really fantastic programs for me. So I guess that is the ultimate lesson that I hope you take away is know yourself, understand what your priorities are, understand what your goals are, and absolutely working and getting a master's can be done, and it can be fantastically rewarding as well. So with that, I'll turn it back to Joe or Vic to share their thoughts.
That's great. And thanks so much for sharing all of your experiences, Amy. It's been really fun to walk through your journey with you, particularly in terms of comparing and contrasting, going for the master's versus getting a specialized certificate and how that had an impact on your career. Now, we'll have a bigger Q&A at the end, but I did have one question for you I'd love to gain your insight on. I know a lot of graduate students end up in a similar boat to how you were describing. Like all of a sudden, the graduate program is utilizing skills or techniques that they either didn't learn in undergrad or hasn't been refreshed, we'll say, in a number of years. And being a grad student, it comes with the expectation of like, oh, you know all of that. Like, you know how to code in MATLAB already. You know differential equations. I tell you, after my differential equation class, I'd like lock that into the back corner of my mind. And then all of a sudden they're like, solve a wave equation. And I'm like, oh no, I'm not prepared for this. But in terms of your experience, do you have some tips for graduate students who might be struggling in terms of any sort of skill gaps between where they are and their program's expectations and how to meet those expectations?
That's such a fantastic question. I think this question can be answered kind of in two ways. The first way is the tactical. We have YouTube, we have Khan Academy, we have so many different self-learning opportunities. I know none of us actually read the textbooks in undergrad, but if you actually do read your undergraduate textbooks, there are benefits there. I think that everybody could probably come up with half a dozen things that they could do if they really wanted to go back and learn something. The second piece of that question that I think is more interesting and more difficult, I really do honestly believe that when we get to a point where we are more afraid of judgment, that is the point where we stop learning. I think we really have to be okay with looking maybe a little foolish or looking a little incompetent in order to really get the foundation that you need to be successful. That is something that is true not just in graduate school, it's absolutely true in industry and in your workplace as well. One of the things that I was told once when I was a young engineer was when you take a new job, you have about a year where you should ask every single stupid question that you can think of. Because once you cross that year, you're going to feel like you should know it. And at the point where you feel like you should know it, that's the point where you kind of try and hide the fact that you don't know it instead of actually getting the information that you need in order to excel. So I would remember that everybody has things that they didn't learn, and that is not a personal failing, that is just a circumstance. And if we are honest with ourselves, as you said, Joe, nobody remembers differential equations. I mean, nobody remembers Calc 2, and I could ask anybody on this call to do like a Norton-Thevenin transformation, and we would all have to sit there and Google it for a couple of minutes. So it doesn't say anything about your capabilities. It does not say anything about your potential or who you are as a person. It's just give yourself a little bit of grace. Give yourself the grace that you would give to a friend who looked at you and said, honest to God, I do not remember this chemistry bit at all. Can you help me?
And I really appreciate that perspective. I think one of the hardest things for me starting my program was giving myself the permission to have that lapse in skill, to be able to go up to my professor or my PI or lab head and be like, I just don't know this. And I think the most surprising aspect to me is no matter how far along I was, 9 times out of 10, they were completely understanding. It became stop by my office hours. Here's someone else in the class reviewing that, or here's an online resource for you to learn. And it was nice. And the more I engage with my graduate students and the more I see this just isn't a me thing, it would be nice to, it's nice to normalize that perspective a little bit, that being a graduate student doesn't correlate to you have to know everything on a whim at any given moment.
Absolutely. And I think that every graduate student should do a little reading or studying about imposter syndrome because it's something that absolutely impacts, I think, a lot more of us than we're comfortable sharing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. But definitely, yeah, thank you so much for that initial talk here, Amy. We'll definitely have time to talk to Amy a little bit more at the end. But for the sake of time, I do want to just switch over to Vic so he can get his perspectives.
Hi, I'm Vikrant. I guess my path in many ways has been the opposite of Amy's. And I guess I can already relate some of my stories to what she expressed in her talk. So I started in 2000, as an undergrad in UT Austin. I had applied to mechanical engineering and electrical engineering. I did not get into electrical engineering. I started in mechanical engineering thinking I will transfer after 1 year into electrical. But I liked mechanical engineering enough that I stayed with it. But I also did a minor in computer programming and robotics while I was at it. Immediately after, I applied for PhD programs all around and started a program at MIT. This was to do with robotics. What I didn't realize at the time was that I was burned out trying to keep my grades up in my undergrad, and I really struggled with my PhD. I decided to just finish a master's and get out. But this indecision also made it challenging because I didn't get the full value out of my master's either, because I started taking classes which had to do with qualifiers and stuff instead of robotics, which I was really interested in. Once I graduated, I wanted to find roles in robotics, but at the time, industry didn't have a lot of robotics going on. The only place you could do robotics was in defense or in the oil and gas business. So I started working in the oil and gas business. Since I was a non-resident, I couldn't really do defense. And in the company, the role I started was on the R&D side, looking at underwater remote interventions type applications where we couldn't get like ships or anything around in places covered with ice. We would need robots to travel long distances to intervene underwater. But what turned out is that the fields that the company was looking at didn't have enough commercial oil, and those research programs sort of dried up. So I transitioned into more traditional subsea engineering, which is deep water oil and gas in like Gulf of Mexico or North Sea. And I sort of went along with it till 2015 when, oh, sorry, I got the date completely wrong in there. So that was till 2015 when the price of oil crashed. And I realized that the oil I was working on was the most expensive oil to produce. And that's not a good situation to be in when the whole industry is sort of reeling back from that. So that was my decision point on, what do I do? I really wanted to go back into robotics, but the field had moved on so much and my knowledge was quite outdated. So for me, the best path to get back into robotics was to go for a PhD. And that's what I did. I started my program in 2015 at Northeastern, and I went through it, one shot, 5 years. And then I started working for Waymo, where I'm a system engineer for self-driving vehicles for pose and localization. And for my PhD, I also did manage to make the switch from mechanical engineering to computer engineering. So I finally became, IEEE worthy. So I guess the big message for me was the realization that in the 10 years that I've been around, the industrial landscape is very dynamic. If you look at like the top 10 companies in the world in 2008 and into 2021, you'll see that I'll help you out here. There are no names overlap here. And this means that as things change in the market, as things move around, there are going to be layoffs. You will not end up doing what you're doing always. So layoff is part of a career. It shouldn't be a surprise. And I guess my message here would be that you should be prepared for it. And I don't mean just financially, that's one aspect. But the other aspects I'm talking about here is keeping your skills current so that, if your industry is not doing very well, maybe there are other things you could do. and also emotionally, where you shouldn't be defined by a job or a company you work for, but just sort of keeping it in the back of your mind that that is only what you do between 8 to 5. Like, there are a lot more aspects to life than a job, and you don't lose your identity if you lose a job. So with that, so as I was looking for jobs in 2015, I had to make a decision on, whether I go back to school full time or not, and that was a big decision. And here is some thoughts that crossed my mind and the process I went through. So I guess it's important to first know what you want to achieve with a program like that. In my case, it was getting the technical skills to be able to be marketable again back in the robotics industry. And as I was looking, I was still applying for jobs as subsea engineers. While doing that, I started a program in University of Houston where I actually took some graduate level math classes. And after I found that I could handle controls again, I could handle advanced calculus again, that made me a lot more comfortable about taking the full plunge and going back for a PhD. The other thing is also recognizing that the university will be different this time. Like, it's not the same as when you went for your undergrad. Like, physically, I would not be able to cram through all night and get things done. Plus, you had the family to think about. We had a very young baby at the time, almost a newborn baby at the time, actually. And then for our family, we'd have to think about how to handle all our health insurance and stuff like that. So a lot of things have to be thought about when you make a commitment like that. And then the bigger one, I think the biggest one, was probably overcoming the inertia. What I mean is, we were living in Houston. We had bought a house. We had stayed in the same place for 8 years. We were very comfortable. We had never thought about what it would take to actually pack up everything and move. So just having to do all that and make a decision to move across country and start a grad school was a big inertia that we had to overcome, not just as me personally, but as a family. And then once we decided, we moved to Boston, and we love the city, we love the place. All these unknowns sort of went away, and things got more comfortable. And once you're in the program itself, that's a challenge of its own. You have to first find your advisor. In my case, my advisor was the same person I worked with during my master's. You need to get up to speed with all the coursework, and like, while I was doing my technical role at BP, the most technical I did was like make spreadsheets. So after 8 years, I had to sort of refresh all my knowledge again to be able to contribute new things. And that also meant getting up to speed with all the research that's been going on. That area has been very dynamic, and that took a lot of work to get current with that. And then you typically start by helping others, more senior people, with their projects to get an idea of how things work, how you can be useful, and how to plan things. And then the most important part, at least the biggest struggle for me, was coming up with a thesis topic. It took me almost like 4 out of 5 years to come up with a thesis idea. And then once I had that, I had to get some new original work done, write it all down, and then convince the committee that it all made sense and it was PhD worthy. So overall, I'm very happy with the whole decision. What did I get out of it? I got to play with really cool robots that I would never have imagined. I worked with drones, I worked with self-driving cars, I worked with underwater robots, all kinds of robots. I got to play with all kinds of sensors that were also very new to the industry: LiDARs, IMUs, cameras, and I got to travel to Antarctica, where we did some penguin surveys using drones. I got to learn about the latest algorithms, the cutting-edge technologies and ideas in robotics. And I can say that these ideas that I learned from, say, 2015 to 2021 are so new that even in my company, I see some of these are not well known throughout the industry. The big difference was that I got to work on interesting problems of my choice. I could sort of convince my advisor that this is something worth pursuing, and then we could look into it. We had the resources, we would have the sensors, the things needed to work on a technology. Outside of my discipline, I got to collaborate with biologists and glaciologists. And sort of a non-career thing is I could work on my schedule. This was before COVID, and spend time with my young kids at the time. So that was a big plus for me to do the PhD. And yes, most of all, I got to live in Boston. We really loved Boston, and we would not have experienced that unless we had gone there for the PhD. So that was a big one. So once I graduated, I wanted to sort of talk about things and perspective that changed coming back to the industry. The big difference I saw was that the pool of problems that you get to choose from is limited by what is important to the company at the time. So you cannot obviously pursue, something very new. But given our industry is relatively young, there's still a large set of problems that you can pick from. In general, I think this is about working is that you need to gain some trust with your seniors, your managers, your team leaders, before you would be allowed to pursue your own ideas. One downside going back to work is meetings, and lots of meetings. With COVID and remote work, this has sort of softened a little bit, I would say, because you can sort of turn your meeting on and keep working on the side. But this is one aspect I'm not very excited about once everyone gets back to offices. Now, in terms of the technical work, what I'm trying to say here is that the scope is limited to, deep understanding in a very small subsystem of a big system. In college, when I was working on a robotic application, I would pick out the platform, the robotic platform itself. I would pick out the computer that would go in there. I would pick out the sensors. I would make sure, the sensors connectivity was what I wanted, USB, Ethernet, whatever else to make things work. Then I would have to calibrate the whole system. I would even have to mechanically put it together, and then actually go around collecting data. And now, in a bigger robotics company, there's a team that does each one of these things themselves. So let's say if you're someone who works on an algorithm, you get the whole thing put together for you, and then you work on the algorithm, which is convenient in many ways, but it also doesn't have the whole aspect of being able to play with cool things. The other big piece is, given that you're working with so many other big teams, and the number of people involved is so much larger, it becomes much more important to be able to communicate and motivate others. When you have an idea or if you think that something needs to be changed or improved, you really need to be able to communicate and motivate them that it is important and it will make a big difference to make that change. So that is something you don't really appreciate while doing your lab work in a graduate program. And the big difference that we would see is for a technical project or a technical algorithm or an idea, the work we do at a university is sort of a demo, and the deliverable that you do, sort of as long as it works 8 out of 10 times, you're good. You can show it. You can call it done. But that is what is a starting point for a commercial application. When you want to turn some project into a commercial application, you need to understand exactly when it works, exactly how it breaks, all the places that you need to be looking for, and then over time, as the application develops, making sure that the performance doesn't go back. So literally, it's like the work begins once the university demo completes. So that's an interesting change of perspective when you go into the industry. And then here I have some thoughts about, as I was picking my career after I was finishing my PhD, the three options I was looking at is staying in academia as either professor or lecturer, going and working full-time in research labs, or going to industry and doing the normal traditional engineering in the industry. So and this is sort of my experience, I'm not an expert on this field, but my understanding is that in academia, there's a difference between tenure-track positions or professorships versus lecturers. And if you want to teach, lecturer might be a good way to go. But if you're on a tenure track, then priorities are very different. The performance of a professor is sort of really measured by the grants that he or she is able to bring in. Like if I look at my advisor or other people's weekly sort of schedules, their most important priorities for the week would be to make sure that their proposals are done. The next would be writing their papers. And the third would be thinking about teaching. And then, again, in academia, I think the professors would get to work, quite freely pick their projects and ideas. They're somewhat tied to the grants that you receive, but generally you can sort of phrase your project or idea to make sure that it sort of meets the grant's needs. So there's a lot more flexibility in general on what you get to work on. The second things I'm thinking here is like research labs, which are more like private labs owned by companies. I got to do a co-op at Mitsubishi Electric Research Labs in Cambridge. But this would be similar, I think, for any like Honda Research or Toyota Research or any of these private research labs. And here, the researchers' performance is measured by the number of papers they can get accepted into journals. And the projects generally they can work on, they're still pretty open, but they have to be somewhat aligned to the company's interest or areas of interest. So, and the third one is the industry. And the big difference I see in the industry is that your performance is obviously what you deliver in terms of products or applications. And the big difference is if you pick the right industry, you could really be at the sort of intersection of research and turning into commercial products. And that's what I wanted to work on, and that's how I decided to go into the industry, where I could take just research coming out of the labs, cutting edge work, and turn it into usable products and ideas. Yeah, so that's all I had planned to talk about, but I can take questions.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Vic. And it was great hearing a little bit more about your experiences as well. To first start with a question for yourself, then opening it up to everyone, you discussed a little bit about the temptation to really define yourself by your job or what you're doing. And I think you can see a lot of that in a grad program, especially a prolonged grad program, where, you start defining yourself by the grades you're accruing or the number of papers you have or the prestige of the papers or the numbers of citations or any of these metrics. And out of curiosity, jumping from industry then to academia for your PhD, then back to industry, what at the end of the day mattered the most in terms of transitioning to industry or even getting an industry job? Like, does an A versus a B matter, or 3 versus 2 publications matter at the end of the day?
So I think it depends on, so specifically for going from PhD to the industry, right? If you're applying and trying to get into a research position at the industry, then your publications is what matters really. Versus if you're trying to do an application base. So in my case, I was looking for systems engineering or systems architecture roles. And in those cases, they cared more about the kind of projects that you would work on versus the papers you got in there. And I think this whole business of working on papers, or sort of not counting papers and counting citations is very interesting for me, at least. And what I'm talking about there is that there's a lot of luck involved in general. If the area that you work on is hot right now, no matter how much big your contribution, how much little it is, you'll get a lot more citations. Versus if I think about the work that I did with icebergs, there are only maybe 20 or fewer researchers that work on icebergs. So even if every one of them writes one paper a year, you're not going to get a whole lot of citations from that. So there's a lot of luck element involved, and people or group or whoever looks at just the number of citations or number of papers, that's not probably the best metric, but unfortunately that's what we have to deal with. In generally, grades I don't think have been as important after grad school. And in fact, if someone would ask me, I have a B in my grad school, and that was a B I'm the most proud of, because that's where I learned the most, and I had to struggle to get the B instead of an A. So, yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you for addressing that. as a question for both of you went through longer programs, both part-time while working at a company, as well as, a full-time PhD, which takes a number of years. So out of curiosity, going through a PhD myself, I'm at year 3 out of 5 here, and it can very much seem like a daunting journey. But how did you keep up momentum over the course of your degree, and what really helped you during low points in your degrees? And we can start with Amy.
Absolutely. So having a plan to find out pretty early was helpful for me. I also think it was helpful to try and make significant progress in my coursework early, and then kind of feel that I was on the downhill side of the mountain as opposed to the uphill side of the mountain. Thinking about what helped me was reminding myself that in 5 years, I was going to be, 27, 28 years old regardless. Did I want to be 28 with a master's degree, or did I want to be 28 without a master's degree? Because the time was going to pass no matter what I did.
Great, thank you. And Vic, your take on the question?
Yeah. So I guess, as I mentioned, like the biggest hurdle for me in the PhD program was like, figuring out what I wanted to work on. That's the big question for me. And what helped is like, making a plan where you revisit your progress every couple of weeks or every month, and make sure that you're making some progress. Even if it's slow, it has to be some progress. So I think that's one big one. The other one was my wife really threatened me that if you don't finish this, it won't be a good place. So that was a big stick there. But yeah, I think just being conscious that, and then I think also being honest to yourself that it's not easy. This is hard, and everyone goes through it. I mean, literally everybody has to go through this. And that's, I think, the biggest part of the PhD, where I think the biggest thing you learn in a PhD is that hard problems are hard, and trying to solve them is also hard. It takes time, and patience is very important there.
Yeah, and I think one more aspect to add on to that too is, there are setbacks, both in terms of your professional career and in terms of your academic degree, whether it's a research project, class project, a course, something like that. There's always going to be something that goes unexpected. So I guess tying more into the theme of the episode, what did you find most unexpected transitioning either at the end of your grad degree or after your grad degree into industry, and how did you handle that situation? And we can start with Vic.
It's an interesting question. What did I find? Amy, do you want to go first while I think about this?
Sure, I can take a stab at it. So one of the things that I was very surprised about when I finished my graduate degree and I was finally a working professional without that commitment, I was surprised at kind of the euphoria of finishing it. Like, I knew I would be excited to finish it, but I was like, oh my gosh, I really feel like I have accomplished something. I was also surprised at how much free time I had when I finished. It had been so long in the program that I really hadn't had a concept of what it meant to have free time, a weekend where you weren't trying to complete a class or work on a project. The other thing that I was really kind of surprised of was how much my community and my colleagues really celebrated me finishing my master's degree. I mentioned that my employer was very kind enough to let some of our HR colleagues proctor all of my exams for me because I was fully remote. So I got to take them during work time in one of these little rooms down by HR. And I told them, hey, I'm scheduling my final. I'm actually almost done. And when I walked into the room to take that test, they had decorated the room for me with a whole bunch of signs that said, congratulations on your final, you've done it. And that was still, even to this day, one of the most touching things because, it is hard. It's a lot of work, but the people around you celebrate with you when you get there. So that was one of the surprising things, because when you're in it, you kind of feel like it's just you and you're on this long journey. But you've got to remember that you're not actually alone.
Great. Thank you, Amy. And Vic, would you like to take a stab at the question?
Yes. So I guess a few things. So I graduated just in the middle of COVID. So a lot of surprise, and going back into the industry at the time a lot of the surprise was around just how things worked, how you could do a whole interview completely remotely. So I would have just trying to do interviews with companies. You do a remote on-site, which is basically 8 hours of interviews on the camera. And there are a lot of benefits. I could just do it and then go back to my kids in the evening instead of having to travel across the country to do the interview. So that was interesting and surprising. The other aspects were about how people were working remotely and how meetings were done, and how much chat and those kind of means became more important. Like the email was the big prime thing to use when I was in my old days, and now it was more like chat. You would just sort of do a chat message with your colleagues and stuff like that. Similar to what you see with Slack now, I guess. The other thing that surprised me was the acronyms and lingo had changed, or maybe it was the industry that changed. But a lot of that was going on. And then I think on maybe a little more serious note, what I've also found was that there were a lot of things to be worked on. Like our products were not perfect ever. And everyone knew that, but it was always about picking the right things to work on for the short term so that we could deliver the next milestone or the next thing. So it was never about delivering the perfect product. It was always about making sure that the priorities are aligned and we work on the most important ones first.
Thank you. And I appreciate that answer. It actually leads into the next question pretty well, which is, in your experience, and starting with you, Vic, what is it like going from, a graduate program, which can be very project or thesis oriented, to industry, which can be very product or customer focused? How do those types of engineering skills differ? And did you find yourself having to relearn how you envisioned a project or envisioned working on a team between these two environments?
Yeah. So I think, so when you're working on a project in grad school, typically it's going to be something, I think that the criteria for picking it is like, can this be published? Usually. And that's fine and fair. In the industry, your sort of the criteria for what you work on is usually like, is the physics of the project or the actual mechanics of the project need this, and then you have to deliver it. You cannot make things work without it. So I would say that's the big difference about irrespective of how many cool ideas you come up with in grad school, you usually end up working on things that are novel or bringing something new to the plate, versus in the industry, you need to be focused about things that absolutely need to be done to deliver a product.
Great. And how about yourself, Amy?
So my experience was very different because I really had a foot in both worlds at the same time. I'd say that maybe a lesson that I learned from both places at the same time was really the length of time that a project could take. In academia, you get very used to classes and things on kind of a semester schedule or sometimes a year-long schedule. The projects that I was working on immediately in industry were years long. It took me probably about 4 years to get my first model of excavator into production when I started. So on one hand, that was actually good practice for a remote graduate degree, which is also a very long process. I think the goals for me were also very different. A graduate degree was something that was very focused on me for my own enrichment. My work was very focused on, as you mentioned, the customer and what my business needed. The second time I went back to grad school, I found that those goals were a little bit more aligned. I was getting a degree so that I could do my job better and serve my customers better. And so I think that was one factor that made the second go around a little easier.
Great, thank you. And briefly here, since we're coming to the close of the hour, I was just hoping you could touch briefly upon how either during your graduate program or during your transition, how did IEEE, either as an organization, technical societies, or HKN as an entity, help you through your transition or those times? Starting with Amy.
Absolutely. So I mostly became involved in IEEE because in my first company straight out of undergrad, I realized how lonely I was. It was a small company. I was one of very few entry-level engineers, and that was a really difficult part of that transition. So when I moved to John Deere, when I started working on a graduate program, I pretty quickly realized that I can't do it alone, which is probably the theme for this whole session for me. And one of the benefits of what IEEE offers, there's a professional technical community. One of the things that I also find really meaningful is the HKN community, which feels very values-based, very personal. I mentioned my community that helped me get through my graduate degree. A lot of those folks are IEEE and specifically HKN. And so having that connection that we could leverage, knowing that we were aligned in what was important to us, was really key for kind of forming those relationships quickly.
Great, thank you. And Vic, over to you.
Yeah, I got involved with HKN pretty late, like literally my last semester, because I didn't learn about it before. And when I reached out, when I talked to people, they very enthusiastically, and I was going to make a move from Boston to California. So my big thing was, I was offered a lot of contacts in California, a lot of people who've been here long enough, and so that was a great to have for me making the transition.
Great, thank you. And just to finish off our episode here, I do want to say that HKN as an organization is looking to heavily invest in you, our graduate student communities, over the course of these ensuing years. We've developed a number of programs, just like GradLab, the podcast series you're watching, to try to help alleviate many of those struggles that we as graduate students face by either offering community, resources, or fun events to disengage from the chaos of the academic world. We do have a number of resources available, such as a graduate student newsletter as well. If you go to our website and go to the Contact Us, we can get you on that list if you're not already on it. And if you are a graduate student who are interested in HKN, please consider checking us out. We have soon to be 269 chapters around the world, so there's likely one at your university or community. And if not, and you want to get involved, please feel free to reach out. We look forward to heavily investing in you over the course of the remainder of your career to make the graduate school process easier, as well as your transition into industry, academia, or whatever life has for you next. And with that, I'll close out this episode of GradLab by thanking our amazing speakers, Amy and Vic. Thank you so much for giving us your awesome experiences and perspectives. And I personally learned quite a lot. And it was great to hear a little bit more of your perspectives on what was valuable in a graduate degree. I know it will aid me in my transition. And I thank most importantly, all of you watching the episode today for supporting these initiatives, and we look forward to bringing more to you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.